be starting shortly. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody, those who are here in the class, as well as those of you who are online, and of course those of you who maybe watch the video later. So this is the continuation of the Heart Essence of Tibetan Buddhism, and I had divided up the third session into two parts. And so we had the first two chapters last time, and so today we're doing the wisdom chapter as a part of that. So I'm indicating it as 3B if you're watching for the document on that. And we are recording, so everything's looking like it's going appropriately. So first, let us begin by taking some deep breaths in and slow breaths back out. And so now, as we did last time, we take refuge. Do that, you can do your own version of that. Those of you who are online, please make sure that your audio is silenced. So I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha most excellent, in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. So now we're looking at chapter 7, and this is about philosophy. So the book in general is divided into 4 different categories. So we're in the first of those categories, the Path of Individual Liberation. And so within each of those 4, there are 3 main parts. There's one on ethics, one on practices, and then one on the wisdom or insight aspect. So that's what we're looking at right now, the Path of Individual Liberation and the idea of wisdom or insight. And actually, generally speaking, there are 5 categories. So I've got 2 of them put into it today that we'll look at. So having previously touched on the teachings of the historical Buddha, now move into the main schools of thought regarding Buddhism that developed following the death and final nirvana or parinirvana of Shakyamuni Buddha. The Buddha himself appears to have been very much a pragmatist, my opinion at least, and a number of other scholars as well. He even refused to answer the big philosophical questions that he was asked, maintaining what he referred to as a noble silence. But with the passing of the Buddha, differences of opinion gradually emerged as a part of this. These differences showed up in several Indian philosophical schools. So they're not necessarily Buddhism per se, but they're these different groups of people that came up with different ideas here. Of these, the most noble were the Shravakas, the Chittamatrans, and the Madhyamakas. Okay, so those are the three, but we're going to divide that last one into three, so it winds up being 5. So don't be overwhelmed by the names. You do get used to them. The key factors of focus for these schools was on the understanding of emptiness. There are different descriptions of this concept, which is associated with transcendent wisdom, and therefore beyond any accurate definition or description of words. So we have all of these texts that describe this idea of emptiness, and yet technically you can't do that because it's beyond words. Nevertheless, the countless volumes have been composed over the centuries to do exactly that, or in some cases to say why it cannot be done. The wisdom view of the path of individual liberation may be characterized as appearance emptiness, the focus on the emptiness of all appearances, commonly divided into self and other, inner and outer, if you will. The Buddha defined emptiness as a lack of inherent existence, so something that's not innate. But what does this mean? Here, in my humble opinion, is an attempt to give an overview of their positions based primarily on the excellent text, Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness by Khenpo Tsultrim. And if you really want to get into this is a really good one because it's just a little thin book. But he does an excellent job of characterizing these things. If you want to really get into it, then there's lots of big books available as well. So the text presents a progression of increasingly subtle understanding of the idea of emptiness. So the 5 stages that I was alluding to just a bit ago. So if you haven't read the Innate Happiness chapter for today, chapter 7, then please do so, because this is kind of complicated stuff, and it's going to be helpful if you go back and you really read it carefully. And of course, if you have questions, send me an email, and I'll be happy to do my best to try and explain. So the 5 listed are the Shravaka stage, who are monastics. The second one is the Cittamatra stage, sometimes referred to as the mind-only school. And then we have a group of 2, Rangtong. So we have the Rangtong Shravaka, Sotantrika. I need to write these things out in pronunciation version. Sotantrika Madhyamaka. And so that's the first of the 3 Madhyamakas. The second Rangtong version is called Prasangika Madhyamaka stage. And then the third one is Shentong Yogacharya Madhyamaka. So it's easier to see that in writing than it is to try and follow through on it, just looking at it. But it gives us those 5 different stages. So today we'll be looking at the Shravaka and Cittamatra, or mind-only school views of these. So the original teachings of the Buddha focused on the middle way of the path between the extremes of indulgence and asceticism. But later, the Buddha taught that emptiness meant empty of any intrinsic existing nature. That is, they are not self-existent in any way, not independent of other causes and conditions. So these 2 principles become key factors in his articulation about emptiness and the reasons behind it. So this is the basis, based on the principles of impermanence first. Things change. It's pretty common that we understand that these days. And dependent arising or interdependent. Okay, so those two things, the idea of impermanence and interdependence, are the key factors that the Buddha is talking about here. So emptiness and dependent arising are held to have the same meaning. Things are empty of inherent or self-existence because they are interdependent. Okay? And we know, especially in science, everything is in some way. That doesn't mean every little thing is related to every other thing, but it's related to at least one other thing. Okay? And of course, generally speaking, it's way more than just one. So the Indian schools, or theories, if you will, differentiated between two kinds of truth, the ultimate and relative. Ultimate truth was transcendent, non-conceptual wisdom, and relative truth was everything else. That is, all concepts, labels, and so forth regarding the Dharma. The ultimate truth was considered absolute, whereas relative truth was provisional. So now we're beginning to see additional characteristics identified with those two classes. So relative truth may or may not apply in other contexts. Since everything that can be explained in words is in some way relative, it can also be argued that all texts and teachings are forms of relative truth, and only direct experience can be ultimate truth itself. Okay? So applied to the two truths, emptiness refers to ultimate truth, and dependent arising refers to relative truth. Echoing Nagarjuna, founder of the Middle Way school of thought, Tsongkhapa, founder of the Gelugpa school of the Dalai Lamas in Tibet, warns that complete certainty about emptiness and dependent arising are very rare. Conventional thoughts can be mistaken as an ultimate level, even though they may not necessarily be wrong at a conventional level. So we look at things, we know things, we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and so forth. We think about things, and it seems to be real on a pragmatic basis in our lives. At the same time, we cannot ignore that we still need to make moral choices. And so if we're saying, well, these aren't really true because they're relative, then how do we make moral choices? Well, the Buddha gave us some hints about that. So relative truth is still important. In fact, we cannot even discuss ultimate truth without using conventional concepts and labels. In other words, our understanding of ultimate truth is dependent upon our use of relative truth to attempt to describe it, limited as that effort may be. So, you still with me now? Okay, so the first approach here is this Shravaka approach. So the Buddha defined emptiness as the lack of any inherent existence, that is, not having not independent, permanent existence, or not being independently self-existent. The Shravaka approach is that the Buddha, or the path of individual liberation with a focus on the emptiness of self, or simply not self. So we sometimes hear that phrase used. It involves detailed analysis of what we mean by self. We act as if it is permanent, independent entity. We think, yeah, I have a self. It's there all the time, never goes away, at least in the lifetime. We are very emotionally attached to this self. It is not exactly the same as person or ego or personality. Those are other phrases that are sometimes used, especially by psychologists. When you are hurt or offended, who or what exactly is feeling hurt or offended? We have to think about that. Who or what suffers? Who or what is afraid of something? Who or what feels bad or good? Why does death seem like such a threat to many of us? Is it all in our mind? What is mind? Is it the brain? Are mind and the brain the same? In what ways are mind and self the same or different, etc.? So lots of questions for us to consider. We might consider Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am." Probably have heard that before. But I am is only a thought. So we can all be sure of this, that we have experienced thought. I saw a t-shirt once that put a more Buddhist spin on it. I don't think much, therefore I might not be. I didn't buy it. I always wish I would have gone back to buy that. When we try to find this self as an entity, we cannot find it. There is nothing there that has an independent, permanent existence. Anything that we can find, if anything at all, is subject to change. It is dependent upon other causes and conditions. Our parents, their parents, food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. So it's interdependent on all kinds of different things. The list just goes on and on. The Buddha often used the example of a dream. So in a dream, we sense that we have a body and a mind living in a world of things. But even if we drown, are buried, are eaten, etc., one of those nightmarish type dreams, when we wake up, it was only a dream. The Shravaka concept of self is very much like a dream. When we wake up, we realize that this concept of self is actually empty of any independent, permanent existence. Appearances of self are not what they seem. The Buddha stated that there is no soul or self, anatman. Atman means self, whereas anatman is no self. So Atman is also translated as soul, which complicates matters here. In either case, it is referring to the existence of some permanent entity. These practices are designated as designed to challenge that concept. Okay? As we recognize the interdependence of these things and so forth, that they're not fixed entities, then we've shocked away all of those kind of things. They're just not true. Okay, so then the Shravaka approach, we investigate our experience of self by simply being as aware as possible in every moment. One systematic way to do this is to use a traditional division into the 5 skandhas. The 5 skandhas are, there's different phrases. So there's skandhas, there's heaps, and there's aggregates. So the 5 are form, feeling, perception, mental constructions or thoughts, and consciousnesses. Okay, so those are 5 Indian, not specifically Buddhist, but Buddhism certainly used these terms. These were common descriptions of the self at the time of the Buddha. So let's look at each one of those and how that fits in this context. Form refers to our body and other things that are out there. So the body, inner, out there, other things. We examine the concept of self over and over and over, again and again, until we gain total certainty that there is no inherent self. Our body is not ourself. No part of our body is self. Nothing out there is ourself. Then we meditate in that certainty until the former habitual patterns of thought about self have dissolved and the direct realization of no self arises. It takes 1 to 9 months of daily practice to achieve this. That's the typical time that it takes to achieve a habit of some kind, unless you are already predisposed to this idea or experience. A lot of us are probably predisposed to it. When we step back a little bit and look at the word self and realize, okay, there is no actual thing called a self, but there's just this word and this concept about a self. The next category is feelings. Feelings in Buddhism are not the same way that we would typically refer to them in our culture, we usually would use feeling as a representation of emotions. Okay? There's no word in Buddhism that refers to emotions per se. Now, they do have words for specific emotions, but they haven't collected them together. And so what they do have is this word feelings. And so the feelings refer to pleasure, displeasure, or indifference. Okay, so it's a very simple kind of an approach. Positive, negative, and neutral, if you will. These are the feelings. Examining these feelings, we find that they are always changing. So they cannot be permanent self. Then we look at it from a view of perception. This refers to the first recognition of input through the senses. The very first moment that something comes in, you're seeing those photons are bombarding your eyeballs. When it very first comes in and you recognize, oh, I'm seeing something. Not by the time you say that, but at the very first moment before you say that. So perception refers to the first recognition of input through the senses. So it's not just seeing, but all of those senses. These include the 5 senses: seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, as well as thoughts. But in this case, thoughts is in a separate category, so we're only really looking at the 5 senses here. The cognition of those sensory inputs. So the input comes in, it's the recognition of them, the moment that we recognize them. In another place that we'll talk about later, it's called contact, a point of initial contact. Although we think of ourselves as perceiving, we do not think of the perceptions themselves as self. Right? Just a perception. So the 4th category are these mental constructions. Mental constructions are our thoughts and emotions. So here they've introduced the emotions to this. So feelings and perceptions are also mental constructions, but are listed separately. So mental constructions are those thoughts and memories that we have that come from all other mental activities of the brain. And then one such construct is personality. Although psychologists tell us that there are few changes in one's personality over time, there are changes. And we may behave in very different ways from time to time or context to context as well. Thus, although personality seems very tangible, it is not the same as the person or self. None of the mental constructions or concepts has an independent, permanent existence that could be called self. We do find here that self is indeed just another concept or mental construction that does not otherwise exist. It's just a mental idea. So then we get to the 5th one, which is consciousness, which means a moment of awareness. Okay, so we become the moment that we become aware of this initial contact. It seems to be unchanging and separate, independent, and continuing from one moment to the next as a sort of stream in time and space. So when we're aware of things, we're aware of them as we go about doing things, and we move our eyes from here to there, and things seem to all be a part of that. Since our sense of self is bound by time and space, it should be possible to divide that into smaller and smaller moments of time. It's like our physicists have done this as well. Since it can be divided into parts, consciousness is also not self. The Shravaka approach is to be aware of the smallest moments of experience in search for a lasting, separate, permanent self. So the idea is to try and find the self in some way, all these different processes. And the evidence is we can't. It doesn't exist, at least not in that way, just as a word or a concept related to a word. Divided consciousness is called Vinaya or Vignaya. Each moment of consciousness is seen as separate and distinct. Since it is momentary, it cannot be self either. At the end of the analysis, we arrive at the conclusion that self is simply a vague, inconvenient concept and nothing in and of itself. From the idea of self comes the concept of other, self and other. Similar, related kinds of ideas, but different meanings. And then from which our afflictive emotions and delusions are said to arise, in the Buddhist view, and then compound themselves. A simple thing arises and then it gets very complex and difficult. So we often tell ourselves stories that make things seem much worse than they really are. As Mark Twain once said, a great Buddhist person, "I have had lots of worries in my life, most of which never happened." The only way to transcend this self-inflicted discontent is to realize anatman, no self. Thus, to remove our ignorance and achieve liberation, we must recognize the true nature of self as an illusory concept so that we no longer cling to it. Or, as Dzogchen Panlap Rinpoche says, this ignorance is a kind of blindness that leads us to believe that the movie we are watching is real. That's a good metaphor, a lot of these ideas of just looking at everything that we're going through, the experiences we have, as if it was a movie. Okay? We'll talk about that again later. So up to this point, I'm going to recommend that if you didn't get all of that very clearly, go back and read it again and again in the book. It's helpful. So the second topic we're going to talk about here is Vipassana. Vipassana means special insight meditation. So it's not necessary to have achieved the highest stage of development in your single-pointed, calm, abiding meditation practice, which we started before, to continue into this next practice. The teachings of Padmasambhava alternate between different forms of these two basic forms of meditation, shamatha and vipassana. So shamatha generally is described as calm abiding, and then vipassana as a conceptual understanding of wisdom. So these throughout the entire path are there until eventually they merge into one, at least in the path that we are following. And so at this point, you may begin to introduce basic special insight meditation into your practice. So we'll get to that. That's going to be the practice that we're going to be doing here. Special insight meditation is often taught as an active contemplative process, both intellectually and experientially. Various techniques are taught for this practice, generally guiding your attention to one or more points of focus to gradually increase your awareness and understanding. One specific approach is to guide the participant through a series of questions about self, as described just previously. After careful reflection, you come to the conclusion that self or I are merely concepts, as we were talking about. And these concepts are interdependent upon other ideas as well. Our notion of a body, personality, mind, and so forth. What is left is suchness. That's a word that I like a lot. It's used a lot in Zen Buddhism, but it's also present a lot when you start looking at it in Tibetan Buddhism. So what is left is suchness, the ineffable quality of ultimate truth. Ineffable, no words, no descriptions. Self and other have no independent or self-existence. That is, they are empty of any inherent existence. The Buddha called this emptiness. Shunyata is the word in Sanskrit. So Vipassana meditation focuses on wisdom or ultimate truth. These practices could have been included in the previous chapter on meditation, but because they deal with specifically with wisdom, I've chosen to place them here as it is necessary to have some cognitive background to better understand the practices. But the goal is not just cognitive understanding, rather it focuses on developing an experiential understanding, a direct experience, if you will. We will separately examine the emptiness of self and the emptiness of other. So there's actually two practices that are in here. So one of them focuses on the emptiness of self, if you will, and the other on the emptiness of other. So Vipassana of Self as a practice. The Shravaka approach uses contemplation of self to achieve the wisdom of no self. That is to say, you will examine the self from several views to develop both a cognitive and experiential understanding of the emptiness of self. The criteria used to determine whether self is inherently existent are that self must be 1, independent, 2, partless, and 3, permanent. So those are 3 standard criteria that are used in these Vipassana type processes. This meditation uses each of the 5 aggregates to contemplate the self and demonstrate that it is not inherently existent based on those criteria. So 1 aggregate and then those 3 criteria. In other words, self is empty of inherent existence, period. The approach described looks at self as a whole and then from the view of the 3 skandhas. An alternative approach is to select just one of the 5 as a point for your focus each day. So you can go through, if you have enough time, you go through all 5 of these each day. If you don't have that much time, then just go through one of them each day. Or another alternative yet, because we also have a second practice here, is do one in the morning and one in the evening. There's different ways. My view of these is that these are fairly consistent with Western understanding and views of these things. So typically is not going to be as difficult, in my estimation, to understand what this is trying to say compared to what the culture in India was and the way that they had to go through trying to understand this. So, practice number 3, the Vipassana of Self. So this is the actual meditation. Again, it outlines the number of days and times and so forth, and the intention to do this practice for the benefit of all sentient beings or whatever other individual intention that you have. And then we recite the refuge. We'll skip over that right now. And then the actual practice of Vipassana of Self. Settle the body, speech, and mind into stillness as before. It's always really good to do that kind of thing. Just take the deep breaths, calm down, calm mind, and so forth whenever you go into a meditative state. Then select one or follow the sequence of mental examinations listed below as your time permits. Begin by thinking about self as a whole. What is self or I? Where is it located? What shape is it? Where did it come from? Where does it go? Then continue with one or each of the 5 skandhas. So you go through that first set of questions in each of those, trying to see how that fits. And then we break it down into these 5 skandhas: form, feelings, perceptions, mental constructions or thoughts, and consciousness or mind. So the first one is to examine the nature of form. Is our body self? Is the body or any part of independent or anything else? For example, food, clothing, shelter, your finger, your hand, your arm, heart, lungs, stomach, and so forth. To give you a bunch of things to look at there. Is our body partless? Or does it have parts? Can it be divided into different parts? Is any part of the body self by itself? Is our body or any of its parts permanent? Continue examining the parts and the relationships until you gain confidence and understanding that your body and any of its parts are not self. Okay. The second one, examine the nature of feelings. Is the feeling of love self? Is the feeling of anger self? Are there any other feelings you experience one at a time? Self. Are any of these feelings independent of anything else? Or is there a cause, such as another person or an event, that triggered the feeling? Can feelings be separated into other parts or categories? Are there both physical and emotional components, for example? Are there any of these feelings that are permanent? Do they come and go? Continue examining the feelings and the relationships until you gain confidence and understanding that feelings are not self. Then we go on to the third one, which is to examine the nature of perceptions. What is the nature of the things that you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch? Those are our perceptions. Are your perceptions not objects as above, but self? Do any of them make up the self? Are they dependent upon other objects, the objects being perceived, perhaps? Can perceptions be divided into parts? Are the perceptions permanent, or do they dissolve or disappear? Continue examining perceptions and the relationships until you gain confidence and understanding that your perceptions are not self. And the fourth one, examine the nature of your mental constructions or thoughts. Are your thoughts self? Are thoughts independent of anything else? For example, your brain, perhaps, independent of your brain? Are there other sources that trigger thoughts? For example, your perceptions. Can thoughts be subdivided into parts? Are your thoughts permanent, or do they arise, then dissolve, or disappear? Continue examining the mental constructions and their relationships until you gain confidence and understanding that your thoughts are not self. And I might add here, the idea of self that we typically use in our culture is different than in India. Okay.
Typically, they're thinking of it as a permanent self, much like a soul. A little different than ours. So it should be a lot easier for us to recognize, okay, these are things that are not permanent. So the fifth one then is to examine the nature of your consciousnesses, multiple consciousness. We usually use the word consciousness as a singularity, but in Buddhism, there's a consciousness associated with each of these different characteristics. So we'll look through those. Is your awareness influenced by other factors? Things that you are aware of? Are there things, perceptions and so forth, that have affected your consciousness? What's going on in your brain? Does what is happening around you change what you are conscious of? Look around here, you see one thing, you walk outside, you see something very different. Can your awareness be broken into smaller parts? Talked about that before in the other ones. The context, the object, the characteristics, perhaps. Several different words that you could use to examine them. How many? Is there ever any finite piece which cannot be further subdivided? Is your consciousness permanent? Or does it come and go? Consciousness is like awareness. So it comes in, goes out. How long does it last? Is it constant or does it change? Continue examining your consciousness and the moments of awareness until you exhaust all possibilities. Well, maybe not all possibilities, but a lot of them. And gain confidence in understanding that your consciousness is not self. Once you've exhausted the possibilities, let go of all thoughts and sit in stillness as long as you can. And here's the critical part: experience it. Okay? So you get to that point, you stop the cognitive continuation of these exercises and just let it go. You know, if you have to, take another deep breath, let it go. And just abide in that sense of peace and calm and contentment. And then there's a dedication, as there is in all of these. By the merit of this practice, may I attain liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings, repeated 3 times. And for post-meditation suggestion throughout the day, look for opportunities to continue to reflect on the nature of form, feelings, perceptions, mental constructs, and consciousness. So as you go about your day, just pay attention to these 5 factors and the questions that we've been talking about. And then in addition, continue to remain mindful of all that you think, say, and do. That's kind of the ground part of this. All right. So let's go on here to the next practice. So this is what I was talking about before. We've got 2 practices. There's actually many, many parts of each one of these, but you can do one in the morning, the other one in the afternoon, or you can do them back to back, like we talked about from last week, or whatever works conveniently for you. So here we're talking about Cittamatra, or the mind-only approach. Some say that Cittamatra approach belongs to the path of altruism, which is the next one that we'll be getting into, which the Buddha articulated the goal of achieving liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings. However, the path of individual liberation also uses this approach to develop conceptual and experiential understanding of the Vipassana of Other. So what we were just going through was the characteristics of self. Now we're looking at the characteristics of other. Therefore, I've included it here because they're closely related and oftentimes actually used that way in practices. So I've included them here. In either case, it's an appropriate sequence regarding the wisdom aspect of these paths, that is, the order in which these evolved. So the Cittamatra means mind only, As with Shravaka approach, consciousness is seen as a stream of moments of awareness. Here too, there are 6 sense consciousnesses, one for the 5 senses and one for thoughts and feelings. These are perceived as facing out there. So that's a little bit different. It's looking out there. However, while the Shravakans take the world out there for granted, the Cittamatrans question that. The division of moments into inner perceiving mind and outer perceived objects is a conceptual invention. Aha! In this view, there is no outer other than mind itself. That's why it's called mind only. That is, manifestations of the mind, as there is no proof that there is any substance other than mind. We might question that today with science, but that idea, you think about it, okay, I'm experiencing looking at this Tonka painting over there. But am I really seeing that, or is that just something going on in my consciousness? Okay. So that's kind of the look here. So solid material things cannot get into mind. That Tonka painting is not actually physically in my mind, right? Or my brain. Mind simply experiences mental events and interprets them, imagines them to exist outside of mind. Of course, the science in here, out there, those are different kinds of issues. All experiences a manifestation of mind. Read that again. All experiences are a manifestation of mind. There is no permanent, independent object. Thus, all is empty of any inherent, permanent, independent existence. Discontent itself is nothing other than a play of your mind. In the dream example, the Cittamatrans ask, how do you know that you are not dreaming right now? Maybe this is just a daydream. The 6 consciousnesses that usually are perceived as facing outwards dissolve back into the 7th consciousness called the alaya, like waves into an ocean. This consciousness is also where the seeds of good and bad karma are understood to be stored. Now, in another case, a new consciousness is for the storage part, but for here, it's considered a part of this one. And then from which they ripen under the right circumstances or conditions in our lives. So waking experience, like a dream, is none other than the play of mind. So all of our experiences in this particular view is that it's just a play of our mind. Mind only. By resting the mind in its own nature, we see emptiness, and all confusion disappears, and mind becomes bright and clear and self-aware. Mind experience, mind or awareness of awareness, and what scientists call metacognition, which we'll come back to later on. This mind is posited as being existent, which has a self-knowing and self-illuminating aspect. When this mind recognizes there are no separate perceiver and perceived entities, you realize the wisdom of mind, or jhana, the 8th and ultimate consciousness. So resting in this emptiness, free from dualistic concepts, you experience the natural spaciousness and clarity of awareness itself. For Cittamatrans, suffering cannot exist in the presence of wisdom. That's an interesting point, an interesting way of viewing things. The alaya consciousness is purified of its ignorance that posits a self, the separation into the duality of self and other, cognitive obscurations, and afflictive emotions, the kleshas, that lead to attachment and aversion, resulting in our discontent. On the most subtle level, every moment of consciousness is purified of all stains of ignorance, and there is not even the shadow of an idea of difference in the substance between mind and its objects. The emptiness or lack of this duality is cleared away, and the light of wisdom mind is experienced as a pure stream of self-aware moments of consciousness. It's all about consciousness. Now, doesn't mean you have to commit to this, but you want to understand it. The mind-only school was extremely influential on the ones that evolved out of that as well. So we'll keep coming back to the idea of mind only later on. So the practice, Vipassana practice. The Vipassana or other meditation follows a similar pattern to that described above, but the focus on perceptions of other or all phenomena, that is the emptiness of other. So the practice that we did before was emptiness of self, and here it's emptiness of other. Again, try to be inherently existent. The object must be 1, independent, 2, partless, and 3, permanent. So again, those are 3 criteria that were used at the time of the Buddha to determine these kind of philosophical views. So the luminous essence, Mipam Rinpoche says, a Buddha will not view any phenomena as truly existent because it is impossible for such a being to see even the tiniest particle as truly established. Okay? You can't find a way for anything to say that it is truly independently established. So there are 2 parts to this examination. First, you examine the nature of the objects themselves in terms of these criteria to show that they are all empty of inherent existence, as we did before. The second examines the nature of the perception itself relative to being inside or outside. Okay. So again, we start the same way. There's a note about how many times and when to do it, the intention that we set, either the standard one here or your own, and reciting the refuge. Again, you can leave out those pieces if you're combining them into a single practice. So the actual practice is first settle body, speech, and mind into the stillness and calm, mental calm as before. And then the first part is examine the nature of phenomena that you perceive as objects. So just pick up an object, any kind of an object to look at. Are any of them independent of all other phenomena? Where did they come from? How did they get there? Examine each object in great detail. Are they partless, or can they be divided into parts? Can those parts be further divided into other parts? Are they permanent? Have they always been? Will they remain unchanged forever? Continue examining these objects and their relationships until you gain confidence and understanding that these objects are dependent upon other phenomena. The second part, now examine the nature of your perceptions of other phenomena. Can you tell if each object is outside or inside your mind? What evidence can you find? How do you know? Note that everything we experience is a manifestation of your mind. Everything is a manifestation of your mind. The experience itself is always in your mind. Observe numerous phenomena and pay close attention to these questions in each case. Continue examining the perceptions and their relationship to inside and outside until you gain confidence at the understanding that your perceptions, what you see as objects out there, are not other than your mind itself. Now, I like to point out here that it's the experience that we're talking about. It's not that there's no objects out there. That is the way that it was described in the mind-only school. There are no objects out there. There are only things in your mind. Part of the reason that this did not succeed. But the idea of them always being in your mind, our experience of them being in your mind, was extremely influential in everything that follows. Okay? So then the third part then, once you have exhausted the possibilities, let go of all thoughts and sit in stillness again as long as you can. And then dedicate the merit for post-meditation throughout the day. Look for opportunities to continue to reflect on the nature of phenomena as the play of your mind. An interesting kind of a phrase. In addition, continue to remain mindful of all that you think, say, and do. Our society is built upon interdependence. Most of us depend on others for our food, clothing, shelter. Our global economy, the level of this interdependence has become extensive, becoming even more visible to us these days with news. We are all in this together, but interdependence functions at many different levels. The cereal that I had for breakfast is not only dependent upon a grocer, the clerk, the truck driver, the manufacturer, and the farmer, to name only a few of those involved, but it is also dependent upon the rain or irrigation for moisture, the soil, the fertilizers for nutrients, the air for both nutrients and carbon dioxide, and sunlight for photosynthesis to grow, among others. Similarly, there are interdependencies at the molecular level, at the atomic level, at the subatomic level. Fascinating as cosmological interdependence may be, human and material world interdependence is of more practical significance in our daily lives. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote that with awareness of the fuller picture, your outlook becomes reasonable, your actions become practical, and in this way, favorable results can be achieved. Okay? I think that's very helpful. The process described above is an intellectual one, but it is also more than that. There is a feeling of openness and spaciousness that occurs as a part of that. That's the experience aspect. As Dzogchen Panlap Rinpoche says, seeing this naturally brings us a sense of relaxation, joy, and even humor. We don't need to take anything too seriously because everything we experience on the relative level is illusory. It's not the way we think it is. When I'm looking at that Tonka painting, I think I'm looking at a Tonka painting. What's really happening is I'm getting deluge of photons entering my eye that then goes into my brain and creates that image over there. Okay? It's in my mind. And we suddenly feel utterly carefree, so much more relaxed and happy. That's always good. Okay. So, dedication here. Through the merit of my practice, may I attain liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings. Through the merit of my practice, may I attain liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings. Through the merit of my practice, may I attain liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings. So next week, we will be in the fourth class because we have 2 3s, but the number 4 in the listing from the syllabus is the Path of Altruism. So we're shifting gears into the second set of practices starting next week in chapters 8 and 9. So again, if you have questions, you can send an email to me and I will do the best to answer those questions, or perhaps if it's a real general kind of thing, I'll try to add them into the video as well as a part of that. I also need to let you know, as we're getting into the holidays, of some days that we won't have classes. And so the end of this month, in November, we're getting into the Thanksgiving period. And so on the 30th, that's that Thanksgiving one. So we're not going to do any classes on that day. And then in December, it's not a holiday, but I'm going to be traveling again like I did a couple weeks ago. So December 7th, we will not have a class. That means 2 Sundays in a row we won't have a class. And so then when we get down to the end, into the holidays, December 21st through January 1st, for the Christmas and New Year's holidays, we won't have classes there. So it's a good opportunity, if you need it, to practice and kind of catch up with your reading and all of those kind of things as well. So in the meantime, please abide softly and deeply in pure awareness with loving kindness, compassion for all sentient beings, always and always. And pray for peace. Thank you.